a yes on the record? Okay, super. So we are recording this. So if you speak, you will be recorded. We have a moving camera, so it's possible that you might even be on camera. Shannon can let you know. Here, but anyways, the town of Manchester created Workspace to support business growth and community, and we're really trying to proactively honor our commitment to inclusivity and accessibility in the business world, supporting entrepreneurs. So if anybody knows anyone locally here in Manchester and Connecticut who might be interested, we do have resources and people who can help advise them. We've been most successful with this type of engagement through our art gallery. The galleries at Workspace, we have the Main Street Gallery, which is where some of us are sitting. We have the Loop Gallery, which is the hallway that connects the meeting spaces and offices and gallery on the first floor. And then we have the Creative Commons, which is where our co-working space is, and we've got art up on the walls and in the conference rooms there. Where what you can see now, and if you come down to visit our gallery, it's our Juneteenth, the Art of Independence exhibit. It officially opened on Monday, but we're having our opening event this Saturday. We'll be open moving forward on the second Saturdays of every month. Our hope is that we're here from 10 to 2, greeting people, giving tours, that we will have an artist on site doing a live artist demonstration, talking to people. Our artist for Saturday is J. Mark Renee, who happens to be working with us all week. We put him in our window, which is so hot. And he's painting 5 large pieces that are going to be on our front window. So we do hope that you either check us out in person or online. We'll have a virtual gallery up and a Facebook album later in the week. So that's about Workspace. When we do an art show like Juneteenth, we like to make it an experience. Thanks to Patricia Johnson for helping us establish that precedent with our Perspectives art show in 2019. So this is our first experience, our conversation on Juneteenth, whether it's something to be celebrated or commemorated, which is thought-provoking for me. It's nothing that I have celebrated in the past. And when I was talking about celebrating, it was brought to my attention that some people look at it differently, that maybe it's not a traditional celebration, but something to be taken with a little bit more, I guess, gravitas, or so to speak. So you can speak on that. Next week, we've got 2 events on Tuesday, a lunchtime event, which is a TED Talk. You can find more about that online. And then Tuesday night, we're gonna have a happy hour. So it is virtual. So you're gonna have to call on your own friends to get together. But Alyssa of Rhythm Brewing in New Haven will be hosting it. Her brew's available here in town at Manchester Wine and Liquor. They're giving 15% off if you want to pick up a 6-pack of Rhythm Brew. And she's fascinating because she is an African-American woman in the beer industry, which is very, very rare. She's also a dancer and an artist, and that's why it's called Rhythm Brew. So she has a lot of great stories. So not only can you drink at home and make it a professional expense, but you're going to hear some great anecdotes about how she's succeeded in business and the relationship she's needed to do that. And then we have another event, which is, I can't remember. We have a poster right there. What's our next event? Oh, this is going to be fun in the camera. Hold on. Hi, everybody. Poems from the Dome. How could I forget that? So Ryan Parker, our poet laureate, and his colleague Matt host Poems from the Dome the last Friday of every month. We've been doing it since January. June is our last one. We're taking a summer break. We hope in the fall when we bring it back, it'll be here in the gallery. And basically it's a poetry open mic night. It's really about love and peace and authentic sharing and expression. And it's amazing the environment they've been able to create online. So you can join us as an audience member. You can join us and recite a poem that's 3.5 minutes or less. The theme of this one, which will be on the 25th at 7 p.m., is Black Joy as a Juneteenth celebration. And it's really something, even if you're not into poetry, you'll be into this. So I hope you can join it. And all of these events are free. So that's my spiel. I'm now gonna ask Dr. Gabriel to introduce the topic of Juneteenth, and we'll take it from there.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Everybody here, everybody out there. Thank you for inviting me here to speak. I know we went back and forth on how are we going to do this. You should know that everyone should know this has been a thing that's been put together. So you've done a great job in, getting together and trying to figure out how we could talk about this expansive topic that has all these different directions it can go in. And so I guess I should start up and I'll just ask people, what do you know about Juneteenth? It's probably one of the best things to do. See, I'm a lecturer, a professor, so I have a captive audience.
I asked if he wanted to bring a presentation. He's like, I have a great one, but no, I don't want to bring it.
Yeah.
So I learned about Juneteenth in my undergraduate years at Prairie View University in Texas.
I know Prairie View. I live in Houston, so I know Prairie View right now.
Yeah, it's a historical Black college university. And it was just amazing to me to even hear about it. I happened to be there in June, which is hotter than anything.
It's a little warm there.
And it was just how everything kind of stopped. And it's like, what's going on here? And even the preparation. And I had no clue because, of course, it's not a part of our Black history curriculum or any history curriculum that I had known about. And I was just amazed to learn that African Americans who were in Texas were enslaved 2.5 years longer than the other slaves in America. And I used to joke, like, guys in Louisiana that just yell across the border, like, come on, you're free. You know, it's like, but I learned that it was both. It was almost like, it was something to commemorate as far as the silence, but then also something to celebrate. It reminded me of like a Louisiana, a New Orleans funeral, where there's a portion of that is, you know, bereavement and sorrow piece, but then there's the celebration that you're no longer, you know, here. So it was very endearing. And I was happy to see it move up to the Northeast.
Yeah. Yeah, so now it's nearly everywhere.
Yeah.
I think probably everybody here has probably heard of Juneteenth at some point. I see the celebration here in Manchester. Even I saw the banner as I came in. No, it's interesting because you can say I have a similar story. So my parents are actually from the Caribbean, and I was born in New York, and I lived in the Caribbean for a while, but they were in New York. And so we came to Texas, and that's how we were introduced to Juneteenth, right? And so for me, I was in third grade. So from third grade onwards, I grew up with Juneteenth as just part of my regular understanding. And my mother was always, wherever we went, she was always big on finding out what the local Black celebration was and what the local Black community was. And so, you know, we were full tilt into it. And you grew up in Houston, you went to either Herman Park, which is like a big park in Houston, or you went to McGregor Park, you probably know these from Houston. And, you know, and I think what you're saying is true. It was us being introduced to this celebration and finding out that it was about commemorating the end of slavery in Texas. Juneteenth literally comes from June and 19th. It's one word, Juneteenth. I would say that's a great Black creation of a word, right? And I think you're right. It was both, you know, when you first asked me, you know, commemoration or celebration, I said it was both. Juneteenth was undoubtedly a celebration. People barbecued, there was music going on. It was definitely a lively coming together of families, and yet everyone also knew what it was about. And so at the same time, you may have, if it was really a bit more elaborate, you had people standing up and doing recitals of poems. People would do their own poems, they'd do Maya Angelou poems. You had sometimes skits. You had all these things to remind that this was both a celebration and it was commemoration of something serious, right? So there was a bit of both that went together. And it was almost seen as fun, but kind of sacred, right? People understood the meaning of what Juneteenth was. And so, yeah, I grew up with it the same way and was fascinated by it. Went to it every year, right? I was at some kind of Juneteenth celebration. And, you know, when I was younger, partly for food. The food was great. But there are ways that it's interesting how that kind of mimics, like when you asked the question, commemoration or celebration, when we were talking about this in the beginning, that kind of mimics how Juneteenth itself was first celebrated, right? When Juneteenth began, African Americans in Texas who have been former slaves are celebrating it often on their own, right? No one else is allowing them to celebrate. It's not something that the state, the former Confederate state of Texas, is not celebrating Juneteenth. And it is a year after, it's in 1866, a year after the June 19th, when they get this information from Union soldiers that arrive in 1865, June 19th. They then, 1 year later, June 19th, 1866, they begin celebrating Juneteenth. And the way they do so is, at first, they have to go out to the woods at times because they're not allowed to do this in public space, right? It is frowned upon. They have to worry about the former ex-Confederates, who by this time are literally waging very violent pogroms against them. And so many have to go into the woods, and they would go there and they would sometimes pray. They would meet together and pray to commemorate the day, and then they would cook food, and then they would have music and dancing and all those things, right? And so there was, again, commemoration as well as a celebration. And what's interesting there is that it endures and it continues to the point that this is still in the 19th century, when those former slaves and free African Americans, again, in the beginning, they're simply meeting by rivers and they're meeting, in places, then they meet in their meeting houses, such as churches and what have you. And eventually they want a public space for this. So in places like Austin, I know, and as well as Houston, and Houston in particular, these former slaves, people who want to find a place to celebrate, they finally buy a bunch of land, right? And they actually make this land the place where they will celebrate their Juneteenth celebrations. And they name it, in fact, I think today it's still called Emancipation Park, right? This is what they name it. And I think it's profound because these aren't people who had a lot of money, right? But this celebration meant enough to them that they pulled together what they could to make certain that they could find a space where they could do this mostly unmolested and do this and have the celebration to commemorate, right? So it's very important celebration in Texas. And as you said, now it's everywhere, right? And I think especially after last year, I think it really entered the national spotlight in ways that it hadn't before.
And you talk about the sacred nature of it, and with many holidays and observances, it starts that way, and then the barbecues get bigger and becomes more of the focus, the Easter bunny, the things like that. Where is it on that spectrum?
Well, I don't think Juneteenth has been so co-opted yet that it's, I don't think it's not like it's not like a gift, it's not like Christmas, it's been that co-opted. But certainly I went to Juneteenth celebrations where the main point was, it's almost like a Thanksgiving. People were just getting together to eat and celebrate, right? But it wasn't a spoken, well, we're going to talk about slavery and the end of slavery, right? The smaller celebrations I went to were mostly just people gathering and having fun. But I think that has its own sacredness, right? The ability to simply sit down, eat food, and enjoy each other's company and families getting together. I think that was merrymaking, but much like I use Thanksgiving as a similarity, I think it can still have that same sacred function.
So Linda, who's here, is part of the African American and Black Affairs Council that advocated to make Juneteenth a formal recognized holiday here in Manchester. And this is the first year, Linda, that's happened?
Excellent.
And I have joining me Pam, who's on the board of directors, and she also advocated along with Diane Kearney. And so, yes, we advocated to make Juneteenth a holiday.
And what does it mean to you that it is a holiday?
It means that we have an opportunity now to really sit back and take stock of history. That we can come together and put in the forefront. Because unlike Pam, I grew up in the South. I knew nothing about Juneteenth. Embarrassingly enough, I must say it's only been like the last 5 years I even heard about Juneteenth. And so to know that that piece of history I did not know really shocks me to my core. It's important because we don't talk about these types of things in school. Although we're working toward it now, we're trying to get a curriculum that includes Black history, right? The history of our people, because we are the people who really made this country. And so it's exciting to me that, it's exciting to me that we now have the opportunity, because this ordinance was passed, because now it's a national holiday, that people will actually get time off of work who live in Manchester to attend, which is a big thing. And so we're looking forward to really having a time where we come together, educate and celebrate and commemorate. Because that 2.5 years I didn't know, it just blows my mind, right? Because we do know that, right? And we do know also that just because they knew, didn't, and someone comes by and says you're free, they weren't really free. And so that's what.
So do you know, was it that we didn't have the internet back then and they honestly, the information didn't get to it? Or was it a conscious effort of the powerful white man just not telling I don't want to be, you know, not uneducated, but they weren't exposed to information. Was it intentional? They just held off for as long as they could?
Okay, so, no, that's a great question. And I'm going to do something that people sometimes dislike the stories for. I'm going to complicate the whole narrative that I grew up with Juneteenth as well, right? And I think that's also what makes Juneteenth so popular. The notion that for 2.5 years, right? Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, really issues, he announces he's going to in 1862, in late 1862. January 1st, 1863, it comes into being, right? Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in those states in rebellion. And so, you know, it is profound. I think when you think that it's not until June 19th, 1865, that enslaved people in Texas, right, officially get this information from Union generals. And that, I think, is one of the things that helped sustain Juneteenth. It's simply a dramatic story, right? It's a story that when people hear that, I think it blows everyone's mind. As a person, however, who began studying slavery, I have questioned that narrative. And I think and I open this in a sense of saying that I think a question can be placed there. And that is this. One thing I know about enslaved people, or one thing I think that I've learned about enslaved people, I should say, is that enslaved people knew a lot. They had a heck of a grapevine. They had to. It was survival. You had to not only understand where you were, you had to understand what your owners thought, you had to understand what everything was going on. You had to know if your owner was running out of money, because that might mean that you might be sold away from your family, or a family member might be sold away. And so enslaved people were constantly monitoring what their owners thought, what the large society was thinking. And so I wonder how many enslaved people did not know, is one of my questions. And this is because, for one, like the information arrives in Galveston. Galveston is a port city. There's news, and one way that enslaved people got information was that they were working on the docks. And when they got information, whether they were literate or not, they could take it back. And if they were on the docks, they might also get a hold of a newspaper. And even if they were not literate, there was someone who was, right? And it was known that people would sometimes sit around hiding because they couldn't do this, where the few literate people, some people stole the newspapers from their owners or what have you, and they simply read it aloud to others, right, if possible. And so I have questioned whether or not some African Americans did know, and we do know that some did. We know, for instance, when they took interviews of ex-slaves in the 1930s, one ex-slave, at least, Felix Haywood, he said, of course we knew. Our owner got the newspaper and we listened when it was read, or we snuck one to ourselves, and we kept up. We knew everything that was going on. We always knew. What else? Remember, as the Union Army encroaches on the Confederacy, you have slave owners who are rushing and taking their slaves and trying to push them further west out of the hands of the Union, right? Some 100,000 enslaved people are forcibly marched west to keep them out of the clutches of the Union. And a lot of them end up in Texas. They certainly knew what was happening in the war, right? And they're going to come into these slave communities and bring that information. And so there are all these ways that information can flow to enslaved people. Even 2 weeks before the Union Army even arrives, the Confederate government in Texas pretty much implodes, and enslaved people there take their chance and begin running. Long before the Union arrived, they start running down to Mexico, right? Because if you're in Texas and you need to flee, you're not fleeing north, right? I think I saw the Tarantino movie, Django Unchained, and in the beginning, he's with some enslaved people in Texas and he tells them to flee north. And I was like, why would you tell them that? Do you know what you have to do to get from Texas to north? You want them to flee through Alabama and Mississippi to get north? Mexico has ended slavery in 1829. And so enslaved people were slipping into Mexico for generations. So much so that even before all this, the Texas Rangers get into skirmishes with the Mexican army because they're trying to retrieve escaped slaves who have been fleeing over the Rio Grande into Texas. To this brought them into Mexico. To this day, in northern Mexico, there's a community there that celebrates Juneteenth because they had come from Texas, right? And so there are all these ways that, in my understanding, I would say, I don't know how many enslaved people knew, but I said a good amount knew. And I said, perhaps what's been lost here is the larger question, not whether enslaved people knew, but what they could have done about it.
Right.
I think one of you said it, in fact, you find out that the Emancipation Proclamation has been issued. That's great if there are Union soldiers around to enforce it. If there's not, the Confederacy is its own government with a massive army. You're not walking up to your slave owner and saying, hey, the guy in that other country you're fighting said that I am, it means nothing, right? And so I think one of the largest stories we have to think about with Juneteenth, I believe, is what opportunities that African Americans in Texas now have with the arrival of Union troops, right? Because in other places, if Union troops were close, African Americans were often fleeing to them if they could, right? Attempting to seek their freedom. In fact, it's those African Americans who are fleeing to Union troops throughout the war that many historians now argue helps push Lincoln towards emancipation. It is their constant fleeing to these Union generals that forces slavery to be central to the Union cause, even if the Union is reluctant to do so, right? It forces the generals to have to ask, what do we do with all these people who are fleeing to us? We can't return them. They are literally the backbone of the Southern economy, right? So what do we do with them? And those enslaved people force these Union generals to push this question up the line to Washington. And, you know, this is what in many ways makes the Emancipation Proclamation possible. And so again, I ask people, I can't say for certain how many enslaved people knew and how many didn't. I know some did. And my gut feeling is that many knew, but many could do nothing about it, right? And so I think one of the things that Juneteenth might be so important for is that it shows that once those Union troops arrive, African Americans can now do something about it. And who knows, 2.5 years, they might have given up hope. They might have given up hope that any Union troops would ever arrive. They heard about it, but it doesn't mean much to me because you have to remember, the Emancipation Proclamation only frees enslaved people in states that are in rebellion, and only if the Union troops are nearby to enforce it. If they're not, it's a good strategy for disrupting the Confederacy in places where Union troops might be close, but down in Texas, it's not going to do a great deal.
So is this repeated in different states? Are there different celebrations of emancipation upon the dates that they were?
That's a great question.
supported?
That's a great question. And that's one of the interesting things about Juneteenth, that whatever the story is, whatever reason that the story, whatever the truth is behind the story, wherever it vibes with history or it doesn't, the interesting thing about Juneteenth is that it endures, because there were a lot of other celebrations throughout the United States. There was, for instance, there was January 1st, the date the Emancipation Proclamation came into being, was a celebration for former slaves throughout the United States in different places. There was January 31st, which was the celebration of the enaction of the 13th Amendment, which is what actually ends slavery, right? The Emancipation Proclamation is like an executive order during wartime. It's the 13th Amendment that actually abolishes slavery. So that's a celebration. April 9th in Virginia celebrated because it's the day the Confederacy surrendered. So African Americans are celebrating that day. There are all sorts of days. If you go into the history of it, Juneteenth is one among many emancipation days that used to exist. There used to be dozens of them, right? If you really sit down and look at them all. And there were even celebrations before the Civil War that celebrated the end of slavery in northern states. So July 5th, for instance, in New York was the great celebration talk about the ending of slavery in New York in the early 19th century, right? And they chose July 5th because they couldn't do it on July 4th. And in the urban North, unfortunately, abolitionism and free African Americans were not popular, right? One of the myths we have is that abolitionism was very popular in the North. It was not. It was a fringe ideology, and free African Americans were often marginalized and suffered violence in the public sphere. In places like Boston, African Americans in the early 19th century showing up in 4th of July parades are chased away with bats and bricks, right? And African Americans have to use July 5th in New York in order to commemorate their own. They say, okay, we'll commemorate our own Independence Day. You don't let us do July 4th, we'll commemorate the end of slavery on July 5th. And so you have all of these different holidays that existed. What happens, however, is most of them die away, not completely. Washington, D.C. still celebrates April 16th as the end of slavery in the District of Columbia, right? Which ended itself in 1862 by Lincoln's proclamation. It has a different date. But most of the others have kind of fallen by the wayside, or they are much more smaller and sporadic. Juneteenth managed to survive, and I don't want to, we can go on later on why that is, because it has its own dynamic history of how it survives and how it spreads. But I don't want to take up all that time.
Well, it's your time, and then I'll let you know a couple questions I had. One, and I guess it'd be different for in every community and every family, but is July 4th, Independence Day, celebrated in the Black community the way it is in other communities, or is there kind of a?
I mean, I guess that's, like I said, I think that's something to speak to different communities. As far as I know, especially in the South, I mean, growing up in the South, 4th of July was celebrated universally. And so it wasn't, I think when I was talking about July 5th, that's the antebellum era. This is Frederick Douglass is celebrating July 5th. And even then they would speak of July 4th, but often, you know, they would, as time goes on, they criticize the United States for celebrating their independence and not ending slavery. One of the things you have to think about with the end of the Civil War is African Americans who had always asserted their rights of citizenship now really pushed to be part of the American narrative, right? And so celebrating 4th of July is important, especially after the Civil War, right? Becoming part of those nationalist narratives, but that doesn't mean they also don't have their own, right? Commemorating April 9th, for instance, the fall of the Confederacy might be more patriotic, some would say, than July 4th, because you're celebrating the end of the greatest threat that the United States ever had to its existence. You know, this insurgency of the Southern Confederacy. And so, you know, I think African Americans have often celebrated those things in plurality, and what it means to each person, of course, in each family always differs.
Professor, that point that you mentioned about the difference between a law in the books and the enforcement in reality, I think it's so relevant. I'm wondering if you could just expand a little bit more on it, because I kind of feel like now that we're talking about July 4th versus July 5th, I feel like July 4th is the ideal that we aspire to. And then July 5th kind of shows us where we fall short. You know?
And certainly African Americans during celebrating July 5th use it not only as a way to commemorate the end of slavery in New York, but to argue for the end of slavery, period, in the United States, right? It's at one of these July 5th celebrations that Frederick Douglass gives his famous speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," right? Where he really hammered, people have heard the speech, he really hammers America for what he sees as hypocrisy in celebrating the 4th of July while it, you know, celebrating this notion of freedom and liberty while it is still a nation that allows slavery to exist in its borders, right? And so you see African Americans, when they commemorate those things, right, it's both a celebration, but they are using it as a political strategy. And so another political strategy, in fact, one of the largest celebrations, one that I study, probably the largest abolitionist celebration of freedom before the Civil War is actually August 1st. And August 1st, interestingly, is the end of slavery in the British Caribbean, right? The British end slavery in 1834 in the British Caribbean, so think Jamaica, Barbados, places like Antigua. And here in the United States, that becomes a large celebration. And African Americans are celebrating it, white abolitionists are celebrating it, and it's huge. It starts off as church services in the 1830s, it expands to picnics by the 1850s, and they are large parades they're having in Boston. It's not as big here in Connecticut, I've only seen a few, but in Massachusetts, it's in Boston, it's in Abington, it's in Lowell. I mean, and these are sometimes hundreds, thousands of people gathering on August 1st, sometimes called West India Day, to commemorate the end of slavery in the British West Indies. And why do they do this? For one, to commemorate the end of slavery of Black people somewhere else, because they say, look, if slavery can end there, it can end here. And they use it as a strategy, right? To say, look at what Britain has done. They've ended slavery in the Caribbean. Why can't the United States do this? And so they celebrate this. And it's, again, the largest probably abolitionist celebration until the Civil War. And that celebration actually remains through the 1870s. I think I've seen some as late as the 1880s before it peters out as African Americans begin celebrating national narratives, because they say, well, now that we're part of the nation, we don't need to celebrate, the end of slavery in a foreign nation, and these foreign colonies will celebrate it here. But it shows you that African Americans are always strategizing, right, in these commemorations, and they always have these deeper meanings.
I feel like one of the strategies is just happiness, like,
Yeah.
I think, Stevie Wonder, when trying to get Martin Luther King to be, commemorated, right, came up with a Happy Birthday to You, which was just like a fabulous song, and you can't feel any happier than that.
Yeah.
I think that's like a really wonderful strategy to use,
Yeah.
Instead of fighting pain with pain, fight it with love and happiness.
I think, all these celebrations, I think going back to that question, they always had a festive, like even the August 1st celebration, July 5th. These were parades. There was a way of showing pride as free Black people. And it was, but at the same time, it was always, we are struggling to end slavery elsewhere, right? So it was always the duality there, certainly.
Any other questions in the room or online, monitoring the chat?
I have one. You talked earlier about the ex-slaves purchasing a park so that they could celebrate.
Yeah.
How long after did they purchase that park, and how were they able to do that?
I can't remember the day. I want to say it's the 1890s, but I don't want to give the wrong date, but I'm thinking it's probably the 1890s. I think slavery ends in 1865, and they purchased this park, let's say by the 1890s or so.
I guess I'm surprised.
Purchased the land, in other words, yeah.
Right. I guess I'm surprised because I'm surprised that they had the financial means to do it. Even though you said they pulled together,
Yeah,
they had to pull together something from somewhere.
Yeah.
They didn't, it wasn't like they surroundings support their freedom.
right.
So I guess, do you have more information on like?
I probably, of course, I don't have it with me right now to give you the full background, but I'll say this in general. African Americans were often trying to find ways to pool resources, to gain economic gain, whatever little money they made, they put it into building churches, for instance, which become core institutions, right? Even with very little. And so you have to think about it, that African Americans constantly do this, but you're right, it's always a precarious situation. As we see talking about things like Tulsa, right? Recently, those goals can always be destroyed. And even, you don't have to be as big as Tulsa, since Black churches are often the social and political center, right, of what African Americans could say we own. It wasn't surprising that those places were often targeted, right, by white mobs and others who, when they thought that African Americans had gotten too far or what have you. And so these sorts of things were common, yet African Americans would continue to do this and rebuild. And so in the case in Texas, I remember in looking at all this, we have to realize, yes, you're right. They face hostile surroundings. And so a lot of this has to be done through a lot of negotiating, right? Someone who may be working or knows the larger white community, right? You have to have people who can say, okay, we want to purchase this land, and this land is not going to be attacked because we have some type of cordial relationship, right? And so African Americans are constantly creating these type of relationships, hoping that they can hold on to what they have to, but it has to be negotiated often. And so it sometimes seems surprising to us, but sometimes when you look at the history, it's fascinating what people are able to do with very little, and even in very hostile circumstances, what they're able to achieve. But yes, it was always precarious. And they have to realize this, right? And so you have to think that even in doing so, they probably have to make a lot of concessions, right? Perhaps I'll do this, but I won't agitate as much for other things, right? And therefore I'll stay out of your hair if I'm allowed to have this thing. And so you see African Americans making these kinds of, basically these, I would say, these compromises in order to find this little space in order to breathe. But it's complex, and and it will cause inner conflicts with people who say, like, this is not important. This other thing is important. We should agitate. And others say, well, no, we need to be able to, have a way to build up land or what have you. And to do that, we have to buy land from a person who is a former slave owner. And, these are complex negotiations. You have to think of, I think you're right, that people have to live in these societies and find ways to survive. And to sometimes, as I said before, know the white community and know what you can push for and what you couldn't.
In preparing for this, in one of our conversations, you talked about that push and pull between the Black community as a community, and then the diversity among Black people as individuals, families, and communities, the geography across the state and across the
Mhm.
world, so. What else do you want to say about that?
So I guess it's a good way to talk about how Juneteenth becomes so popular. So how does this celebration that's mostly in Texas now end up everywhere, right? And what happens when they meet these other celebrations? Do people like them bringing their Juneteenth into their celebrations that they have in North Carolina or in Minnesota, what have you? Some places don't, right? They're like, well, Juneteenth is nice, but we have something here we're already doing. And if you look at early on, if you look at like the post-slavery period into the 19th century, there are arguments in Black newspapers and write-ups on which day should be celebrated. No, it's January 1st. Everyone should do that. No, it's January 31st. No, we want ours in April. And there was friction based on region, based on what people think is politically important. There is even arguments August 1st should no longer be celebrated because we don't look patriotic if we're celebrating the end of slavery in the Caribbean. Right? There's even arguments over how it should be celebrated. We should have solemn celebrations that simply show us in church services, right? And very serious. We should not do anything merrymaking, not because it cheapens the holiday, but perhaps because it will allow people to create further stereotypes of us. If Black people are dancing in public or cooking in public and making barbecue, what you'll see then are stereotypes of Black people in local newspapers. So perhaps we shouldn't do that. And these are old arguments. In the antebellum era in the North, Black newspapers are basically trying to stop people from dancing, because they fear how the white community will use this to attack the Black community, right? They are limiting in what they're doing, and yet they're justifiable fears because these stereotypes are happening. And so what we see is these dilemmas that are going back and forth in the African American community over how to celebrate these things, and even whether or not they should be celebrated. Some say we shouldn't celebrate the end of slavery. We should be forward thinking. Slavery's gone now, right? To think about the shackles of slavery is going to shackle us to they see as a disdainful past. We should look forward and we should forget about that. And so there are arguments to not have any of these celebrations. And then others are cynical. Right? One of the reasons some of the other celebrations die out is that they look at what's happening with the end of Reconstruction. Right? A Jim Crow apartheid falls on the South that's going to sweep over the nation. They're watching Confederate monuments go up, even as they're trying to celebrate emancipation. There are these anti-Black riots. Tulsa is just one of them. There's East St. Louis, Springfield. These things are happening constantly every year. There's mass lynchings. Some people are cynical. They said, why are we celebrating the end of emancipation? What difference did it make? Right? They feel that, especially a younger generation who wasn't born in slavery, they see it as antiquated, right? And so there are all of these debates over how these celebrations should be done, which ones, when it should happen, and if they should happen at all. And the miracle of Juneteenth is that somehow in all of this, as the others kind of die away, that it survives. And it survives in great part for several reasons. We have a determined Black community in Texas and places like Austin and places like Houston who keep it going. I don't have pictures to show you here, but in the early 1900s, there were these lavish commemorations and parades that African Americans hold in Houston in the early 1900s. I'm talking with like horses and carriages, if people have seen these pictures, decorated in flowers and different things. And they're able to do this because they have their own Black districts where they can do this, and they've negotiated this with the larger white community that allows them to do this, right? And so we see this celebration continue, and then the Great Migration happens. All right, African Americans are leaving leaving the South, heading to the North, heading to the Midwest. What do they bring with them? They bring things like Juneteenth from Texas. Right? That's not, however, it stays, because Juneteenth will end up in Seattle and these other places because these African-American migrants from Texas are going there. But then after maybe a generation, it peters out, right? The kids are now from Seattle, they're from Chicago. Why would they celebrate this old commemoration from Texas? And so it kind of has these fitful starts and stops in different places, but it travels. But what many people think is the greatest boost on why Juneteenth manages to spread around is actually the 1960s. By that time, most of the other celebrations have pretty much died out altogether. Juneteenth is one of the few that is that large and is that pervasive, that it's continued all this time. And in 1968, after the death of Martin Luther King, he had actually helped plan this, a Poor People's March that's led by Ralph Abernathy and others, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy of the Civil Rights Movement. And they meet in Washington, D.C., and it just happens to coincide that the day they end up doing this is June 19th. They have one of their largest meetings. I think it becomes the last of the march, right? The official last of the march for a host of other legal reasons and getting permits and other things. But on that day, he tells various delegates, he said, when you go home, I want you to take Juneteenth with you. Even if you've never had Juneteenth there before, I want you to take it here and take it back to your respective communities. And I want you to use it as a form of strategizing and organizing in civil rights action, right? And it's thought that many people do that. And that helps spread Juneteenth to various different communities that may have never seen it before, like you spoke about. They've never seen Juneteenth before. And we start seeing small, sporadic Juneteenth celebrations. And then I think what doesn't get enough attention, the miniseries Roots in the 1970s, late 1970s, really, it starts the genealogy craze in the United States that everyone is into, but also for African Americans, it really starts this investigation, especially after the Black protest movements of the 60s, really this investigation of slavery, right? It was even something that even during the Black Power movement, slavery wasn't the thing that was talked about as much, but certainly by the 1970s and Roots, it becomes this topic that through the miniseries Roots. And we see by 1980s, we see many more Juneteenth celebrations. And as you pointed out, arguing for its inclusion, it's African Americans who are pushing and pushing for it to be recognized by the local jurisdictions where they are. So I think in 1980, Houston or Texas, it might be all of Texas, but I know Houston recognizes, really officially recognizes Juneteenth. It might, pardon me, maybe the late 70s, but also in 1980. I'm remembering either 79 or 80, I'm getting my dates confused. But certainly by the 1990s, we see it spreading. And so I think it's really that period between 1968 to today where it's spread around. And because all of these other commemorations have pretty much petered out, it becomes the one that everybody's using now, no matter where they are, right? And I think also because of the story that goes along with it, because it has that tail end, right? It's in Texas where it's the last place that this news of the emancipation can be bought. I think for all of those reasons, it has become the holiday now that stands in for all forms of freedom days. Even if the others have been forgotten and gone, it's the one that is most held on to. Though again, as I pointed out, that's not complete. In DC, for instance, April 16th is still Emancipation Day. In some other places, they still celebrate the others. Yeah. But it's a complex story, right? It's not so simple that Juneteenth and we just have it. It's got this complex history, but it's fascinating.
And I will add, because I'm from Connecticut and I went to Texas, Township. And when I learned about it, and a lot of my friends went to HBCUs, came back home to Connecticut. And that's when I saw the conversion of Juneteenth coming together in Hartford. Hartford makes it a gala. It is an upscale gala. You wear your African attire, and it's an experience. This year, Hartford is having it in King Park. So as Linda said, I'm a part of the African American and Black Affairs Council. I'm also on the town's board of directors, which is our city council. And the push for Juneteenth was kind of ironic. It was on the heels of getting an ordinance for racism as a public health crisis, which was not easy. And then when we were proposing Juneteenth, there were so many different contrasts to what the holiday should look like from other people's purview. And when I say other people, pardon me, people who are of non-color, who said, well, let's make it a day of celebration. Let's call it a day of diversity, without understanding, no, this is not a day of celebration, even though we bring different holidays and cultural experiences to make Manchester more diverse and more inclusive. I had to really address the full understanding of what Juneteenth was to get the vote passed. And the sad part is, even after we got it passed, basically it means every town entity is shut down. It's an official holiday. there was conversations about making it a floating holiday, being an option. And it's like, you wanna make Christmas a floating holiday? You wanna make Washington's birthday? So it's like, no, we don't wanna float it. We've done enough floating. And so then it was like, let's make it a day of service. It's like, we don't make Christmas a day of service. We don't. So I'm going down the list. So I said, now if someone wants to serve on that day, fine and good, you don't have to. And you would have to know my humor. So I'm just gonna say what I said. I said, the irony is, it's a holiday. Do with it what you will. On Martin Luther King's birthday, ironically, you have people that go to church and they have other celebrations. However, if you would look at the sales papers, you would notice that Macy's and JCPenney's usually have the white sale. So for those who want to go and buy linen white sheets on Martin Luther King's birthday and do whatever type of service you would want, you can. That is my humor. That's just me. So we can, which I think we need to call Macy's and JCPenney's like, hey, no more white linen sales on Martin Luther King's birthday. But the dialogue in trying to get this to become a holiday was even different than a dialogue for racism is a public health crisis. And you should have seen the dialogue about, which we did just pass, a civilian police citizens review and relations board that was on Tuesday. But in any case, the dialogue is just different because a part of Juneteenth is educating. And a part of the education is the fact that there were human beings who were still not free on American soil when people in their minds thought that they were free. There was white fragility, there was guilt around even the dialogue. And after we passed the ordinance and made it a holiday, believe it or not, sadly, there were some people that, well, I don't want the holiday. It's like, well, you want to go to work, give the keys to whatever office in town, you are free to go and work on a day that you don't have to. Which the irony is, we hear so often people pushing for family leave. And here Manchester is giving 13 official holidays, which a lot of the towns in Manchester don't have. And I think also the irony of it being Manchester. I think we only have 3 towns that have made it official. And my council people in Windsor and Bloomfield will call it, how did you do that in Manchester? With the history of Manchester. And I will be very brief. The history of Manchester is we were one of the original sundown towns, meaning after the sun went down, if you were Black, you had to be out of town unless you had papers in your pocket saying that Miss Millie had me doing the well later. So therefore I couldn't leave at 5 o'clock, right? And then you got to pardon my joke about this, but an original sundown town now celebrates Juneteenth, now has racism as a public health crisis, now has a civilian police review and relations board. And it goes to where the town is going. It has not been easy, but we're getting there. And the momentum from Juneteenth, again, comes with, it's almost like it comes out of just different people's connection, word of mouth, so to speak. And sometimes what I've seen is the celebratory part of this is entertaining for some people. It's trendy. You now have other ethnic groups wanting to celebrate Juneteenth because they're looking at the celebratory piece of it and it's trendy. You have some people who've gone to Juneteenth celebrations and go, I don't know what it was about. The party was great. The food was fantastic. The HBCU bands were out of this world. I have no idea what I just celebrated, but it was great. And so I think when things take on a trend, when they have a certain look, people will try to identify. Now, again, when it became very real, when we talked about, let's talk about this in school curriculum as a part of history, then it's like, you're not talking about parties and cookouts and barbecue anymore. And so even though we have the ordinance passed, I would not want people to believe that it was free and easy. It was not. It was not fully understood But because we had the community at large, the African American and Black Affairs Council pushing, and that is how it came to be in Manchester. So I'm hoping that it will be celebrated statewide, and it is at the governor's level. It is being looked at to make Juneteenth a official holiday in the state of Connecticut, which would be very forward moving for Connecticut.
That's fantastic. And I think the story you're telling is, I think that can be repeated for so long. I mean, the entire reason that Juneteenth remains a holiday is only because African Americans are preserving it. And the only reason it's recognized anywhere, it gets any official recognition, is because African Americans are pushing it. No one is giving it. Nobody's like, oh, here you go. Right? That didn't work that way. Just like it didn't work that way with the end of slavery. It was never a here you go. It was pressing and pushing and forcing it along. And so, you know, I think that story probably is playing out at this moment. It's probably played out before, and it's going to, because Juneteenth does have the celebratory aspect, but it also evokes slavery. And it is the topic that America doesn't know how to talk about and doesn't want to talk about, right? It's why Roots as a miniseries was so profound, because for that moment, it introduced a lot of people. And yet these were things that many African Americans have been familiar with. So that was one of, I think when you're talking about the issues now of Juneteenth becoming a much more popular holiday, African Americans often celebrated it whether other people paid attention to or not, right? So I often wondered when African Americans were celebrating, when I was down south, that we would be in, McGregor Park, where there are people driving by like, what are they doing?
Aren't they supposed to be at work?
Yeah. What are they doing? Why are they in the park? But now everyone knows. And I think, of course, I think someone asked before, is it probably going to have its own white sale or something? Probably. Who knows? That's one of the things that happens when the holidays become larger. But it is interesting to see the exposure that's gotten, especially after last summer with the George Floyd protests and everything else. I think it took on an even greater meaning. And it's going to be interesting to see how it's going to clash now. What we see all of these states trying to ban things that they don't understand. From teaching things that they couldn't define themselves. If you ask them, I'll bet all your money on whether or not you can define that. Oh, got all your money. They're still passing these laws against it. And in a way, they're trying to erase the history that they can't, because we all know now, right? And we have these things like Juneteenth. So it is interesting to see what I have to call these backlashes that happen, right? As soon as, like you said, you win and you have these ordinances, and some people will say, well, I'm gonna go to work anyway. Okay, you're not gonna take a holiday? That's interesting. You see these backlashes to it, but I do wonder, how can you put those things back into the can? Everyone knows now. We live in an information age where this information is hard to keep from people. And you're going to have these dichotomies now where you have some states passing laws saying these things can't be taught in school, but there's this massive Juneteenth celebration that's also going to be talking about slavery on those days. And so I think we're in an interesting moment for how people want to approach these issues. But yeah.
I think one of those dichotomies too is just growing up in Connecticut, slavery was always taught to me about something that was in the South.
Mm-hmm.
And then as an adult, I grow up and I find out that there was slavery here in Middletown and all over.
Yeah.
And then of course, it's like we have all these farmlands, of course.
Yeah.
It makes so much sense as an adult, but as a kid, you're just taught it was a Southern thing.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
That's I grew up with it in Texas, and I'll say this, our textbooks weren't teaching us a great deal about slavery. We were there, not much. My education about slavery in the Texas public schools was poor, even though our Texas history book was like this thick. It didn't mean that we learned much. What I had to learn from that came from going home to my parents, going to Juneteenth celebrations, hearing it at church celebrations and other things. That's how I learned, often outside the school board. So we're still having these fights over school curriculum. Know that this is old hat.
I kind of feel like it's an information age, but how educated are we? I kind of feel like, I'll be really honest with you, history was not my favorite subject as a kid. Now as I'm older, I love it. I wish I would have spent more time learning it, because it just makes today so much more real. It helps me understand where we're at. And I just wonder, like, we say we have all this information at our fingertips, but I don't really feel like we're really educated, you know, I feel like to really get to the truth, you have to do a lot more research.
But I think you also have to talk more with
Yeah, like
different
moments like
people.
this.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
thank you for that vote of support. I want to see if we can turn on microphone. You don't have the ability through the system?
I can, but the person doesn't want to ask the question.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
so that's fine. So we're figuring out this hybrid model with a new technology, but we do have a question here, so let me see. Do you perceive the potential distortion of history when all of the events relegated to the process of slavery to emancipation are viewed as a celebration and real social change, remains a serious issue? Could this distortion of true history, which has demonstrated, or it's clouded history for path of enduring change? So like our original topic
Yeah,
of
an urgent question,
conversation.
yeah.
And, by celebrating it, I know, and I did have a conversation with some of the organizers of the town's celebration. And I think the banner says Juneteenth celebration because it was probably ordered long ago, but I just looked on the their website where they're promoting it and it says Commemoration. Because we then had that conversation and he's, and we're like, well, what should we call it? And I'm like, I don't know, maybe two white people shouldn't be making this decision. But how does the fact that the celebration in the eyes of the white community maybe distort, or in the Black community, but distort the seriousness of, there's still issues of freedom and independence today?
I'll say, I think that is always, I think what we're seeing is that is a question that people are going to have. And it's something to remember that Juneteenth, like any other commemoration or celebration, is not static. The reason that people are celebrating it in 1866 are not the same reasons that they're celebrating it in 1890 or 1950 or 1968 or today, right? And so it's going to change. Its meaning is going to change. It doesn't remain the same. And so these questions about whether it's a commemoration or a celebration are something that people are going to have to answer. And I think it's probably going to be answered individually. It's going to be answered geographically. And I think you're just going to see different, people arrive at different answers. And so it's hard for me to give an answer on how it distorts it, because I suppose it could. I'm sure there were people looking at us in McGregor Park thinking they need to take this more seriously, or people who may have thought like, no, this should be a form of Thanksgiving where we have camaraderie and family coming together. What happens now that it's opened up, as people say, to a larger community? Even though back then it was open to anyone. I mean, it wasn't cordoned off that people were barred from coming, but the people there were 90% Black, with maybe a few city members coming in. But what happens when it becomes larger? Those are questions that I think we're going to be grappling with, and we're going to have to see. And I think, as the person's talking about here, the question is asking, how does it relate to the present day and the issues of the present day? As I pointed out before Juneteenth, various Emancipation Day celebrations, whether they were August 1st or July 5th, were often also around strategizing against the issues of that time. Equality for African Americans in the North, the end of slavery. These things were constantly being stressed. So it's not surprising that today, thinking of Juneteenth, it's also going to have its own political issues to be stressed that are going to have to meet the moment of the day. And again, that's going to be up to individuals, boards, and groups as people on how they decide to do so. I think as you're seeing I think it's interesting, this art is right for Juneteenth, and this art is diverse. I see some people here with art of their family. I see other art that's abstract. I see art celebrating Black joy. I see others with trauma. And so, I think people are going to have to come to their own decisions on how they do that. Yeah.
So thank you so much. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah.
Really great. So I am the immediate past president of the Amistad Center for Art and Culture.
Oh.
So I'm not sure if you're familiar with.
Yes, I am.
Fantastic. Good. Because
I've had a
we're going to be
chance to speak there
talking.
once. I've had a chance to speak there once, actually, yes.
And our executive director has been invited probably, 6 or 7 times this year to go to companies and talk about Juneteenth.
Yeah.
And so I've been participating with her. on the sidelines watching while she
Yeah.
fields all the
It
questions.
is interesting, isn't it?
It's very interesting and, you know, in the corporate settings, it is amazing that many people have not heard about Juneteenth, and the people that have typically are people of color. But right, so most people, as we're seeing the dates, one of the first questions she asked, when was the first time you heard of it?
Yeah.
2020 or, you know,
Yeah.
2021 right now, you know, like different answers. I find there to be an opportunity for us to continue to educate. So, right, as an African-American museum for art and culture, I feel like there's work that we should do, because I feel like if we don't do it, it won't happen. So as much as there are, you know, laws coming to be about having African-American history in the curriculum, I understand that initially it's not required. It's right, it's optional. And I don't think that our history should be optional. I think, right, African-American history is American history, and we need to do it. And I feel like if we're not going to teach it in the schools, then those arts and culture organizations need to then pick it up and need to take it on and carry it forward. And not for nothing, I think one of the worst things we do as a people, and I'll include myself in that, is organize. And if we wanted Juneteenth to be passed, I don't know about you all, but I wrote at least 15 letters to Brandon McGee, who is leading the bill here in Connecticut, to say, what can I do? How can I help? Let's get ourselves together. Let's figure out how to do it. And the session's about to close. It's not on the agenda. It's not going to pass. So the next time there's an opportunity is January. Why? Because we didn't organize. We did not come together. We did not figure out how to do it. So I would love to see us as a people here in this community, get our lives together, like get ourselves together. And if we want change, to drive change. And I appreciate people like Pam, who I know works at this every single day. You're one human.
She's been a big supporter. So when I saw you, and I said, this is gonna be a connection.
This is good. No, this is really good. So that's one thing I want to say. And then the other thing I just want to talk about, because I have such a weird, I am a true American mutt in the room. So my mother's family is from Tulsa, right? So my mother was born in Tulsa, my grandmother, my great grandmother. So I'm sure that they were there. My grandmother, actually, my great grandmother, right, who had to have been born in the 1905 maybe, had land. I remember as a kid going there, and so it's interesting to hear the stories. And so when I asked my mother about it, so what's going on with the Tulsa thing, Mom? Like, you've never discussed this with us. What's happening? She said, well, we were not allowed to talk about it. After it happened, we were told you are never to discuss it again. And it definitely wasn't taught in Tulsa. It wasn't taught in the schools. So there was really no conversation. So still this idea of this psychological safety that doesn't exist for people of color, even though we're in times of quote unquote freedom, right? 1920s, this is well past the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation and 1865, right? It's 1920 when this happens. So think about that. Think about the psychological safety for people who I'm sure had amassed this, right, economic wealth. So it's kind of one side of my history. In that same side, my great grandfather and my grandfather, my great great grandfather and my great grandfather were both Native Americans. So, right, so think about that, like the magnitude of these people who were Native, whose lands were taken from them. Then, you know, the Black people, right? The Natives and the Blacks came together and their lands were torn down, and we still rise. We're still persevering, and here I sit, and I'm really proud of that. On my father's side of the family, I'm also a descendant of the Georgetown 272 song, following the story about the enslaved folks down in Georgetown. In the Georgetown area, my grandfather was Isaac Hawkins Sr. So he was the first person listed on that roster of 272 enslaved people. He is my fifth great grandfather. So my father's family was from Louisiana. And so all of those folks, those enslaved folks, were sold from the Georgetown area and around Maryland down to plantations in Louisiana. And so to think about their lineage, so both of my grandparents were one was from Baton Rouge, one was from New Orleans, right? So that history and thinking about how they made their way from Louisiana back north. So my parents met in New York City in Harlem as I was born, and found their way together and created me and my brother. And we have this really rich history, and I'm really proud to understand the history, and also saddened, like so many emotions, right? Also saddened about, think about what we could have been if we could have just been ourselves, and then rejoicing because you know what, I was supported, I was loved, I was cared for, had a lot of psychological safety growing up, and to think that my ancestors had to deal with any of that or all of that is just amazing. And I think the one thing I take from this is think about the humanity of the people who in that slave ship behind you had to endure to create what we have today. I just hope we never have another Tulsa. But I thank you for being here. It's amazing.
That's great. It's beautiful. Thank you.
So I think we've talked about ways to enhance this conversation. One is through politics and municipalities and governments, which you so effectively advocated. Another is through the school system and education, through corporations, through community groups, through religious groups. And because we're sitting in an art gallery, through art. So with just a few minutes left, and I don't believe this is one of your specialties, but how does art and the imagery of the Black community help both either in the celebration and the commemoration? You pointed to the diversity of the art here.
Diversity here.
But I think that's an interesting conversation to have. And, the Amistad Center with its association with the Wadsworth Athenaeum obviously believes in art as a tool, which is what we're trying to do here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because I'm not schooled in arts, I will say, so I appreciate looking at it. I mean, certainly, I think it's funny, I teach a class on slavery and film, so I actually look at different ways of representation. But certainly, whether it's visual art or art of this form or literary, I think there's a way. I think something that you said that's important there is that it's often people of African descent who are preserving stuff, right, and keeping it. And it is interesting that I think of Juneteenth as a celebration. It's its own performance in itself, right? It was its own artistic type performance that people would come together and gather and, in a sense, perform their freedom, right? It was to remember and perform the fact that they were free, and remembering what had been done and those who had not been free, right? Those who did not make it out of slavery to enjoy freedom. And so it's this way to commemorate that, not only to commemorate the emancipation, but to commemorate and think about what enslavement was and what that meant. And so never forget it, right? To not let it be forgotten and to go by the wayside. And I think that goes on, even if people are just sitting there doing barbecue or what have you. I think in there, everyone knows why you're here for Juneteenth, right? Everyone who is celebrating there, whatever outsiders might think, everyone there has been drilled with that story. My family came from the Caribbean and we were drilled with the story immediately, right? We understood immediately what was being celebrated here. And my mother was able to tie that to the slavery in the Caribbean and think about emancipation in the Caribbean and what she understood about slavery. And she would find those commonalities, right, that existed. And so I think that has its own, I know I'm taking away from the visual art here, but I think that has its own expression. I think that was its own artistic expression, down to the very art of watching a person do some barbecue on a grill, because that is fine art if you ever seen it done. And so I think that's a way, I think there's something in that at times we don't think about, that just the act of having those things was a type of performance in itself. And I think we have to sometimes think of it that way, and how we use these things to preserve these memories, right? And think about it, if Juneteenth disappears, then how do people talk about enslavement and thinking about freedom and trying to remember it, right? It disappears, and the fact that people hold on to it, I think is fascinating.
Yeah, I think the way that Andrea said it, the cost of not being able to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think every community, ethnic, cultural community has that own story.
Yeah.
which I would hope would increase the empathy and compassion we have for other communities. I think the more that we can talk about it, and share the stories and share the perspectives in word and song and poetry and film, barbecue, in art. I also want to acknowledge Trey Brooks, who's one of our artists here. So not only does he have multiple pieces in this display, we have 4 jersey barriers, cement barriers outside, which have created a summer patio space for people to sit and congregate, bring their laptops out, their lunch, things like that. So he painted one of those for us, and we just want to thank the contribution that the artists are making to our community. And we're doing our best to get people down here to see the art and to experience, as you said, the joy and the trauma, because art is a form of self-expression. And that's what we need to do, is create safe places for people to express. So I want to thank you very much for being here. I think we're going to wrap up. We do have evaluations, very short evaluation forms. If anybody wants to give us feedback, they're on paper here, or you can email it to us for people online. What we're interested in knowing is how you heard about this program, because we want to know how to get the word out. We want to know what positive takeaways you have from it. If you could give us, something that was meaningful to you, something you learned, something that was reinforced. Anything is great. If it's something we can use as testimonial, that's even better. And then any suggestions about this particular program, what could have made it better, different, and what we might want to do in the future. So those are our 3 questions. How'd you hear about it? What are some of the positive takeaways, and any other thoughts or suggestions you have? So you can put my email in the chat. We've got forms for you. So we're going to close out the Zoom and stop recording unless anybody else has any questions.
Jennifer has a question.
Why am I not seeing that? It must be only going to you as the host, but she thinks it's me because it's my name.
Right, yeah. Pat, can you want to ask your question?
Oh, there's a question. Oh, no, there's a comment. Oh, I see Pat's off the microphone, her hand's up. So go ahead, say your question, Pat. We'll see if we can hear you.
It was just in response to the question of art and can you hear me?
Yes.
The question of art and its contribution to change. And I think art is way more than self-expression. It's the ability of the individual to take experience and create a medium in which other people can connect to that experience and deal with the truth. So there's so many truths and so many different truths. And sometimes I think truth is like a way to stop under a shady tree and it changes. So I think we have to pursue the truth in Juneteenth Day, in every day, and utilize and appreciate the ability of our artists to tell us the truth, even if we don't want to hear it.
Thank you.
Profound this is, yeah.
Yes.
A lot of people don't want to hear the truth, or at least don't want to confront it.
And it's hard, and I think we also have to create space, and I'm sure, Pam, you felt this, for people to react in what we think is irrational and defensive and inappropriate, because we have to be trained to have these difficult conversations. And I don't believe we are, and I don't know if it's any easier in the corporate world. But I think it definitely is a skill, and we've had some trainings here for the town of Manchester, some of which were mandatory, which is always challenging. Like, you will come here and learn this. But I think, it's a step in the right direction. And the more conversations we can have with people like you, the better. Any other comments before we wrap up?
I would just say, in the corporate world, willing prisoners are much easier to train.
Yeah. Yeah, I attended something and somebody asked if I was a hostage or a volunteer, I think. And I said, what? And they're like, are you required to be here? I said, yes, but I think I'm here willingly. All right, well, thank you very much on behalf of Workspace and our growing artistic community. our creative community, which includes our entrepreneurs, and we're looking for ways to combine the business-oriented entrepreneurs who are creative and strategic in their own way with the more visual arts and things like that. And we're growing in different ways, and this really helps us. So thank you very much. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you all for being here. And we will post this. So have a good night. I think you need to end it.